I was folding the dish towels. The ones with frayed edges. They used to be white. Now they were the color of old clouds. The house was quiet except for the sound of the heater ticking and the soft thump of chairs being pulled back in the dining room. I was not invited. But I heard them anyway. "This is my house," my son said, laughing. "She's just staying here." Just staying. I paused mid-fold. My hands stopped moving, but the air did not. I stared down at the towel. The one with the tiny tear in the corner. I had stitched that tear years ago when this was still our home. My husband had picked this house. I paid for it after he passed. It was quiet and warm, and the front porch caught the morning sun. I had never asked for more. One room. One cup of tea in the morning. A soft chair by the window. But something in his voice pushed me out of the walls. Like I no longer belonged in the blueprint. Like I was furniture waiting to be donated. I folded the towel slowly. Set it on the counter. Walked down the hall to the old oak cabinet with the rusted hinge. The drawer stuck for a second. Then gave in. Inside a photocopy of the deed, the purchase agreement from 1997, and my name. Not his. Not even yet. He was added later as a cosigner when the roof needed repairs. But the ink told a different truth. I ran my fingers along the paper. The edge was soft with time, but the signature was still sharp. Still mine. I didn't speak that night. I served dinner. Laughed when they laughed. Smiled when they smiled. But something had shifted. Something quiet. Something steady. They think they know whose name belongs on this house. But names fade from memory. Not from contracts. And I still have the paper to prove it. The first year in the house was quiet. Andrew was 12. He used to fall asleep with his head on my lap right there on the floral couch we bought secondhand. Back then, the walls echoed differently. Like they were still learning how to hold our laughter. My husband Richard had picked out the property from a local paper. It was a faded listing with a blurry photo of the porch and a crooked for sale sign. He circled it in red ink. That was always his way, make things visible when others overlook them. We bought the house in 1997. I remember the handshake with the realtor, my palms sticky from nerves and Arizona heat. Richard signed first. Then I did. And just like that, we started over. He passed 5 years later. Heart attack. Early morning. I found his coffee still warm on the counter. I kept the house. Paid off the mortgage with his insurance. Cut back hours at the library. Took up substitute shifts at the high school. It was never easy, but I always came home to something that was mine. I planted yellow roses in the front yard. Hung wind chimes from the porch beam. Crocheted curtains from leftover yarn. Andrew grew tall in these rooms. He broke his wrist on the back steps. Had his first kiss under the dogwood tree. And when he left for college, I walked from room to room in silence, touching walls like pages in a book I was trying not to close. He came back 7 years later, married, tired, and needing a place to reset. I didn't ask questions. Just said, "The guest room's yours." We shared dinners. Laughed a little. But I noticed something slowly change. He started saying my yard. My schedule. My space. The word ours fell out of use like an old coin no one carries anymore. And when Stephanie moved in, she called the guest room her studio. Started rearranging furniture without asking. She moved my rocker. Hung a new mirror where our wedding portrait had been. I told myself to let it go. I was used to shifting. To being the one who adjusted first. But one afternoon I reached for my teacup and found it replaced. A glass mug. Tall. Modern. No handle. No weight. It was sitting in the cabinet like it had always been there. But it hadn't. The cup I loved, a simple blue and white one with a fine crack near the base, was gone. I searched the shelves. Every one. Even the back of the pantry where I kept old honey jars and rubber bands. Nothing. No one had thrown it out. No one had asked. It had just disappeared. That night, I sat at the table alone. The new mug steamed in front of me, but it held no comfort. Stephanie walked by. She didn't look twice. Just reached for the light switch and said, "We might want to repaint in here." In here. Like it wasn't my kitchen. Like the meals, the stories, the late-night tears on this tile floor, belonged to someone else now. Andrew didn't say much anymore. He came home later. Ate quicker. Talked in short clipped sentences. When I asked how work was, he said fine. When I offered tea, he said I'm good. When I mentioned repainting the hallway, he said Steph has plans. Steph had a lot of plans. She brought home swatches. Pulled down the chimes. Moved the dogwood planter. One day, I came home and saw that the porch swing, the one Richard built, was gone. Too creaky, she said. Not safe. No one asked. No one warned me. They just removed it. The sound of that swing had rocked Andrew to sleep when he had ear infections. It had held my hands when I cried the day we buried Richard. Now it was gone. I stood on that porch and listened to the quiet. There was no creak. No wind. Just the sound of a house, forgetting who built it. Inside, I opened the cabinet and found my towels folded differently. Neatly. But wrong. Stephanie had started doing the laundry. Said it was easier if she took it over. Easier. Like remembering wasn't worth the trouble. I went back to the drawer in the hallway. Pulled it open again. Touched the edge of that paper. My name. His name. The year 1997. Not out of anger. Not yet. Only to remind myself that once before anyone else had keys, I had the door. It was a small thing, that paper in the drawer. But some days it was the only thing keeping me from forgetting myself. I started walking more in the mornings. Down to the edge of our neighborhood where the trees turned gold and the sidewalk cracked near the post office. Old places whispered louder than new ones. There was a bench near the corner where Richard once waited for the school bus with Andrew. Sometimes I sat there and watched the leaves fall slow and brave. No one asked where I went. No one noticed when I came home. I cooked dinner at 5. Stephanie said 6 was better. She started ordering groceries online. More efficient, she said. Soon I stopped buying tea. Stopped baking cornbread. Stopped putting out the yellow napkins we had used every Sunday since 2001. They didn't match the new tablecloth. Andrew didn't argue. He just let it happen. Like he thought peace required my silence. I learned not to knock when their bedroom door was closed. I learned to turn the television down when her friends came over. One afternoon, I found her hosting what she called a ladies' circle. 12 women I'd never met drinking wine in my living room like it belonged to them. I waved. Only 2 waved back. Stephanie said, "Don't worry, they won't be long." Not we. They. I stepped outside past the roses I had planted, now trimmed too short. The wind chimes were gone. The dogwood planter was cracked. The porch had new cushions I didn't pick. I sat on the step. My bones ached in the cold. But I needed to sit with the truth. This house didn't push me out with force. It didn't slam doors or pack bags. It erased me one small change at a time. A new towel here, a missing cup there. A silence too long to interrupt. Inside, they laughed. Not cruelly. Not loudly. Just. Without me. I stood slowly, walked back in and past the hallway mirror. It didn't recognize me. So I opened the drawer. Pulled out the folder. Took it into my room and laid it on the bed. Then I sat beside it. And waited for the next moment they'd tell me this was not my home. Because I needed to see if the paper would still feel warm in my hands. The first thing they moved was the photo. It had sat on the mantel for over 20 years. Our wedding day. Black and white. Richard in his navy suit, me in a borrowed veil, smiling like we owned the sky. One afternoon, it was gone. In its place, a wide canvas print of desert cactus, and a quote about growth. Stephanie said it looked more modern. I said nothing. Instead, I found the photo in the hall closet tucked behind a stack of board games. The glass was cracked. I wrapped it in a towel and placed it in my bottom drawer. Next went the recipe box. A wooden one with a hummingbird carved on top. I had copied each recipe by hand. Peach cobbler. Chicken dumplings. Richard's favorite molasses bread. I found it in the garage. Beside the broom. Covered in dust. Stephanie said she was digitizing things. Easier to search, she smiled. I nodded. And walked away. Then came the guest list for Andrew's birthday. 40 years old. They planned a big dinner. I offered to make the deviled eggs. The ones he always asked for. Stephanie said, we're keeping it catered for consistency. The invite came by text. A group message. I wasn't listed as family, just a name under other relatives. When the night came, I sat quietly on the edge of the party. They gave me a plate late. No one asked if I needed tea. I watched Andrew blow out the candles on a cake I hadn't baked in a house I once paid off. When he looked at me, he smiled like I was a neighbor who had dropped by. Not his mother. Not the woman who stitched his school shirts and rubbed balm on his fevered chest. A polite smile. That's all. Later that night, I went to the linen closet to grab fresh sheets. They were gone. Replaced with silk blends in plastic wrapping. Hotel quality, Stephanie had said. My old cotton ones, yellowing soft, were nowhere. I didn't ask. I didn't cry. I just stood there staring at a shelf where the past used to rest. Every room felt like it had a new owner. Every corner was being rewritten without my name. And still they said I was lucky to be included. The day they painted over the hallway was the day I stopped recognizing home. I had gone to the pharmacy. When I returned, the walls were beige, soft, dull, and empty of memory. The gallery of frames, photos of Andrew in his baseball uniform, Richard holding a fish at the lake, my sister and I in Easter dresses, were all gone. Stephanie smiled. We're going for a cleaner look. Cleaner, like childhood was clutter. Like history made the walls too heavy. I checked the hallway closet. Found the frames stacked loosely, some without glass. Some bent. The photo of Richard had a new crease across his face. I traced it with my finger, and felt something splinter quietly inside me. Later that week I caught Stephanie explaining the house layout to a delivery man. She called the kitchen my zone and the guest room our shared office. She pointed to the living room and said, "That's where we unwind." No mention of me. I stood in the archway like a coat rack no one planned around. That evening, I asked Andrew if he remembered the garden plot his father used to keep. He blinked. Oh yeah. Wasn't it? Overgrown. I didn't answer. We used to grow herbs there. Basil, rosemary, a tomato plant that never gave up. I walked outside later to find the plot replaced with gravel and patio furniture. Stephanie said it was low maintenance. I said nothing, but I walked into my room, sat on the bed, and made a list. It wasn't a loud list. Not about revenge. Just a record. A ledger of the erased. The porch swing. The dogwood planter. The blue cup. The wind chimes. The photograph. The recipe box. The linens, the walls. Some women lose a house in a fire. Some lose it one drawer at a time. I folded the paper and slid it into my copy of the deed. If they needed reminding, I would let the ink speak. Not today. Not tomorrow. But someday. When they drew the line too clear, when they finally said it out loud. This is our house. I would open the drawer and gently remind them who paid the first brick. It happened in the smallest room. The laundry. I had always folded towels a certain way. Twice long ways, once across. So they'd fit the cabinet just right. Stephanie folded them into tight squares. Stacked them like store shelves. Efficient, she said. One morning, I opened the cabinet, and all my towels were gone. Replaced with white bleached ones, cold to the touch, too perfect. I checked the garage. Nothing. Checked under the sink. Gone. I asked Andrew. He shrugged. Save his space. Then I heard Stephanie on the phone in the kitchen. I've been doing so much lately. It's basically our house now. Our. Not mine. Not hers. But ours meaning not me. That word was the loudest thing I'd heard all week. I walked to the hallway. Stood beneath the new light fixture that buzzed slightly when it turned on. There used to be a lamp there. Yellow shade, a small hummingbird carved on its base. It had been a gift from Richard. I hadn't seen it in months. I wandered the house that day. Not like someone walking through home, but like someone checking for cracks in a building she no longer owned. Each room had a layer of newness that didn't ask permission. Each drawer had fewer of my fingerprints. Even the mirror in the bathroom had changed. Frameless. Cold. I stared into it. Not to see my face, but to look for proof I still existed. That night, I made tea in a pan. They had boxed up the kettle. I sat at the table alone. The seat creaked under me. At least that sound was still mine. I drank slowly. Let the warmth settle my hands. And I thought of the paper. Still in the drawer. Still with my name. There are things you lose all at once. And things you watch be taken in inches. They hadn't said it yet. But I knew the moment was coming. And when they did, when the sentence finally left their lips, I would be ready. Not to argue. Not to scream. Just to unfold the truth, place it gently on the table, and say nothing at all. It happened on a Sunday. Stephanie was rearranging the living room again. Throw pillows. A new area rug. Candles with smells I couldn't name. Andrew sat with his phone. Not speaking. Not asking. I stood in the doorway watching her place a ceramic bowl on the shelf where Richard's books used to be. She caught my eye. We're thinking of turning this into an open space, she said. Feels more breathable that way. I didn't reply. I just looked around the room. The couch was new. The curtains were linen, not lace. Even the clock ticked differently now. Later that evening, they were talking in the kitchen. I stayed back, but the walls had ears, and so did I. Andrew said she's having trouble adjusting. Stephanie replied, well, this is our house now. She's just not used to sharing. Our house. I turned away. Went back to my room. And then I heard it, so soft, so final. Andrew's voice barely above a whisper, but sharp as a snapped branch. She needs to understand whose house this is. Not a question. Not a mistake. A declaration. I stood in the hallway. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From clarity. They had said it. At last. And now, I could answer. I opened the drawer. The paper waited. My name still there. Unfaded. Untouched. I ran my finger along the seal. Still sharp. Still legal. I didn't need a lawyer yet. But I remembered Harold's number. It was written in the back of an old cookbook. I pulled the book down from the shelf. The spine cracked gently like something waking up. And there it was. His name. His number. A note in Richard's handwriting, trustworthy. Knows the house. I called. The phone rang twice. Then a familiar voice said, well, now Eleanor. Been waiting to hear from you. And for the first time in months, I let myself breathe fully. Because someone still remembered whose home this was. The next morning, I made coffee in my old enamel pot. The one with the chipped rim. It hissed softly on the stove like it too remembered. I poured it slow, held the mug in both hands, watched the steam rise in the quiet kitchen that used to carry so much noise. Birdsong filtered through the window, the kind Richard loved, sharp and hopeful. I sat at the table and pulled out a notebook. Wrote down dates, mortgage numbers, purchase year, all the small truths that live longer than memory. I tucked the note beside the deed, folded the towel just the way I liked, and waited. Because something had shifted. I was not just a mother, not just an old woman keeping out of the way. I was still the name on the very first line, and lines matter when the world forgets who you are. Harold met me at the cafe just off Main and 3rd. Same table as always. Right under the window with the crooked blinds and the chipped blue sugar bowl. He wore the same brown jacket. His hair was whiter now, but his eyes still knew the weight of paper. I brought the file, he said. And there it was, the original deed, our signatures, the purchase date in fading ink. He handed it to me like an heirloom. You're still the legal owner, he said, tapping the second page. Andrew was added as a co-signer, not as a transferee. It's all here. I nodded. I'm not ready to sell, I said. I just need to know that I still exist in my own home. Harold didn't smile, but his eyes softened. That home doesn't exist without you, he said quietly. We sat a while longer. Two old friends sipping lukewarm coffee and trading quiet truths. When I got home, no one noticed I'd been gone. The television was on. Stephanie was on a video call. Andrew was mowing the lawn. I walked past them. Past the new lamp, the new rug, the new silence. And into my room. I opened the small lockbox where I kept Richard's cufflinks and Andrew's first lost tooth. Placed the deed inside. Right beside the things that still mattered. That evening, I made dinner. They ate without thanks. Stephanie said the rice was dry. Andrew didn't look up. I washed the dishes in silence. But something had changed. Not in the house. In me. I moved slower. But steadier. I folded the dish towel with both hands. Aligned the corners, pressed the crease. And I felt it, the weight of names and the peace that comes when you stop asking to be seen. Now I was waiting. Not for permission, but for confirmation. The moment they'd say it again, the house, the ownership, the hierarchy. And this time I wouldn't retreat. I'd reply without ever raising my voice. With ink. And history. And a name they had nearly erased. That night I stayed up later than usual. The lamp on my nightstand buzzed faintly. I opened a notebook and wrote down what Harold had said. Word for word. Sometimes, truth needs to be copied by hand. I underlined the phrase, you're still the legal owner. Then closed the book gently, like sealing something holy. Outside, the wind picked up. I could hear the dry leaves scraping across the driveway. It sounded like time trying to be remembered. I placed the notebook beside my pillow. Let my fingers rest over the edge as if touching the page made it more real. There was no anger in me. No fire. Just a stillness so deep it felt like strength. I was no longer waiting for someone to hand me back my place. I was keeping it warm until I chose to take it back. The moment came sooner than I thought. It was a Tuesday. I was trimming the dead leaves from my yellow rose bush. The one I planted the year we moved in. Stephanie stepped outside. Her voice sharp with practiced sweetness. We've been meaning to talk to you, she said. I wiped my hands on my apron. Waited. Andrew joined her. His arms crossed. His eyes not cruel, just tired of pretending. Stephanie started. We think it's time for you to start considering other arrangements. I didn't speak. She continued. There are lovely communities now. Assisted living. Comfortable. Private. She said the word independence like it was a gift she was giving me. Andrew didn't look at me. He was staring at the ground like maybe the dirt would swallow him. We just want you to have what's best, he muttered. Best. As if being erased politely was better than being pushed. I nodded slowly. Not in agreement, but in recognition. They had said it now. Fully. Without dressing it up. I walked inside. Past the photos that weren't mine. Past the rug I hadn't chosen. I went to my room. Opened the drawer. Pulled out the folder. And brought it to the kitchen. They were still standing there whispering. I placed the folder on the table. Opened it. Turned the deed toward them. My name. Richard's name. The date. The seal. I said nothing. Didn't need to. Stephanie's face lost color. Andrew's mouth opened, then closed again. Silence. It filled the room like a truth too big to deny. I pointed to the line under owner of record, then to the note in the margin in Harold's writing, rights retained in full. Still, I didn't speak. Not because I was angry, but because I was done explaining. They stared, and in that moment I wasn't invisible. I was undeniable. I closed the folder slowly, lifted it from the table, and held it to my chest. No words. Just the sound of breath settling into stillness. Stephanie broke first. We didn't mean. But I raised my hand gently. Not to stop her. To remind her silence could be louder than excuses. Andrew took a step forward. Then stopped. His voice was low. Why didn't you tell us? I looked at him. Not with anger. Not with pain. Just the calm that comes when you've been quiet long enough to know exactly who you are. I was waiting, I said, for you to forget completely. So I could remind you properly. He nodded once. No defense. I turned and walked to the window. The roses caught the late sun bent but still blooming. Behind me, they didn't speak. They didn't move. And for the first time since Richard passed, I felt the house shift back into its rightful shape. Not because I reclaimed it, but because I never left it. They just stopped seeing me. The morning after I opened every window in the house. Let the air in. Let the truth settle. The wind moved through the curtains like it was searching for something. I stood in the hallway where the walls used to hold pictures of scraped knees, school dances, quiet Christmases. They were still gone. But I was no longer searching for them. I walked barefoot into the kitchen. The floor cold beneath me. Grounding. The kettle was gone, boxed up again. So I boiled water in a saucepan the way my grandmother used to. I found my blue-rimmed cup in a cardboard box marked donate. Still intact. Still cracked. I held it in both hands and let the steam rise into my face like a blessing. They hadn't said a word since yesterday. The house was quieter than ever. Stephanie avoided my eyes. Andrew left early. I didn't chase conversation. I had no appetite for apology, shaped like convenience. I spent that day cleaning. Not out of anger, but out of reclamation. I polished the banister. Shook out the rugs. Dusted shelves they never touched. Each task felt like a whisper to myself. You are still here. This still belongs to you. I even found the old wind chimes tucked behind paint cans in the garage. Hung them up again. They sang like memory returning. That evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket and a cup of chamomile. The air smelled of dusk and dry earth. A car passed. A child laughed down the street. And I felt held. I thought about Richard. How he used to rub my shoulders after long days at the library. How he always paused before turning the key in the front door to savor the sound of coming home. I whispered his name into the evening wind. Just once. Then stood and stepped back into the house. Inside, the light had changed. Stephanie was in the kitchen staring at the folder still left on the counter. I didn't say a word. Just walked past her with the quiet of someone who had already chosen her place. In my room, I laid out a sweater to mend. The one with the missing button. I threaded the needle. Hands steady. Some repairs are slow, but no less permanent. As I sewed, I thought about the shape of silence. How it changes once it belongs to you again. Not the silence of being ignored, but the silence of choosing not to ask for a place at your own table. I finished the button, held the sweater up to the light. It looked whole again. Not new, but true. Later that night, I walked past Andrew's door. It was ajar. He was sitting on the bed staring at nothing. He didn't see me. Or maybe he did, but didn't know what to say. I almost knocked. Almost. But stopped myself. Some things aren't fixed by forcing a conversation. Sometimes you let people sit in the weight of what they've done. Let the truth ring in their ears, the way it rang in yours for months. I returned to my room, turned off the lamp, and slept without folding myself into the corners. I slept in the center, because that's where I belonged. The next morning, Stephanie didn't come out of her room. Andrew made coffee. For himself. He didn't speak. But he looked at me like someone unsure how to face what they broke. I took my cup, added a splash of milk, and walked to the porch. The roses needed trimming again. I brought out the shears. Each snip felt deliberate. A quiet ritual of taking back shape. Halfway through, Andrew stepped outside. He stood at the edge of the steps watching. I didn't know, he said. I kept trimming. I should have asked. About the deed. About the house. Still, I said nothing. I thought we were helping. But I see now we weren't. I looked up. Met his eyes. You stopped seeing me, I said softly. He nodded. A pause. Then I don't know how to fix it. I rested the shears in my lap. Some things aren't fixed, I said. They're honored. He sat on the step below mine. Close, but not too close. We watched a squirrel race across the fence line. The wind moved through the chimes. I remember that sound, he said. I nodded. We stayed like that a while. No plans. No promises. Just two people, trying to find the thread back to something real. Later, I walked into the kitchen. Stephanie was there. Her hair still damp, eyes puffy. She didn't speak. But she placed my blue cup on the counter. Clean. Dry. Whole. Beside it a sticky note, I'm sorry. I didn't smile. Didn't forgive. But I nodded once. She stepped back. Gave me room, and for the first time, I poured tea into something returned. The sound of it was small but steady. That afternoon, I opened the windows again, dusted the old lamp and placed it back in the hallway. Hung the hummingbird curtain over the kitchen sink. Not for nostalgia. For presence. Because I was here. Still. Still here. In the late afternoon, I took out the photo album. The old one. Leather-bound. Edges frayed. I sat at the dining table and turned each page slowly. There was Richard with paint on his jeans the day we first painted the porch. Andrew on his third birthday, chocolate smeared on both cheeks. Me in my librarian cardigan holding a book in one hand and his tiny fingers in the other. None of those moments fit into their new version of the house. But they were still mine. Stephanie passed behind me on her way to the laundry. She paused. Looked down. That was in the hallway, she said, pointing to a photo. I nodded. It belonged there. A bit past. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a nail and a hook. I didn't throw them away, she said. They're in the drawer. Then walked off quietly. I placed the album down. Went to the hallway. And for the first time in years, I hung that photo again. Centered. Straight. I stepped back, looked at it. Not to remember but to reclaim. Because healing is not always loud. Sometimes it's a picture frame, going back where it always belonged. It started with a knock. Not on the front door. On my bedroom door. Stephanie, holding a folded blanket and a cup of tea. I thought you might need this, she said. I took the tea. Warm. Faintly lavender. She lingered. I've been thinking, she began, then stopped. I didn't understand what this house was. Not really. I let the silence stretch. I thought it was just a place, she said. 4 walls. A fresh coat of paint. Some storage. She shook her head. But I see it now. The way you touch the railing. The way you know which floorboard creaks. The way you never forget where things used to be. I looked at the cup in my hands. Sipped once. I still have a lot to learn, she said. I didn't respond. But I didn't close the door either. Later that morning I walked to the back shed. The one Richard built. The one no one touched for years. It smelled of cedar and dust. And memory. I opened the old trunk. Inside his toolbox. Andrew's tiny handprint in plaster. A quilt I never finished. I pulled it out. Unfolded it in the light. Each square was different. One had a teacup. One had a pine tree. One had Andrew's name stitched in crooked thread. I ran my fingers across the seams. They were loose in some places, but strong where it mattered. That afternoon I brought the quilt into the house. Laid it across the couch. The new one. No one moved it. No one commented. But that night, when I walked past the living room, Andrew was asleep under it. One arm draped out, one hand resting on the square with his name. He didn't know I saw. I didn't tell him, but something in me softened. Like a thread pulling tight in just the right place. The next morning I found the tea still warm in the cup beside his chair. He must have reheated it. Or maybe Stephanie did. Either way, they had begun to notice what stayed and what mattered. I returned to the shed. Dug deeper in the trunk. Found a letter. Unopened. Addressed to me in Richard's handwriting. My breath caught. It was dated 2 months before he passed. I sat on the workbench. Opened it slowly. Carefully. Inside a short note. I built this house for you. Not for someday, but for always. If they ever forget that, show them how to remember. My hands trembled. The paper, like the deed, was thin. But the truth was thick in it. I folded it again. Held it to my chest. And knew for the first time in a long time that what was planted here was more than walls. It was voice. It was vow. And I had kept it safe. I kept the letter in my apron pocket all that week. Not for show. Not for threat. Just as a weight, a center. Stephanie moved quieter these days. Her heels no longer clicked on the tile. Her voice lowered in the hallway. As if she finally heard how loud she had been. One morning, she knocked again. I'd like to help with the garden, she said. I handed her gloves. Let her pull weeds beside me. She didn't ask about the plants. She watched. Learned with her hands. We worked until noon. Dirt under our nails. Silence between us, not empty, just uncluttered. At lunch, she brought out an old cookbook. I found this behind the microwave, she said. Some pages were dog-eared. I opened it. My handwriting. Faded ink. Grease marks from Richard's fingers. We chose a recipe together. Corn chowder. She chopped. I stirred. Andrew set the table without being asked. We ate quietly. No one reached for their phones, no one complained about salt. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was a beginning. That evening, I walked through the hallway. Found 3 photos restored to the walls. Not the full gallery, but a start. Richard and Andrew fishing. Me at the library desk. Andrew in his graduation gown. Placed neatly. Centered. Hung with care. I reached out and adjusted one by half an inch. Just to say I still see everything. In the den, the quilt was folded at the edge of the couch. Not put away. Not hidden. Stephanie had added a pillow that matched its border. Soft, pink. Like the azaleas that used to grow out front. I walked outside barefoot into the cool grass. Looked at the porch swing Richard once built. Still gone. But I saw Stephanie measuring the beams with a notebook in her hand. I didn't speak. Didn't ask. But I watched her write something down. And that was enough. That night I opened my sewing basket. Not to mend. To sort. The threads were tangled. Knotted from years of reaching, then retreating. I smoothed them one by one. Laid them in rows by color by memory. The red thread was from Andrew's baby blanket. The green from Richard's camping kit. Lavender my mother's apron. As I worked, I heard footsteps. Then a quiet knock. Andrew. He held a photo in his hand. Is this you and Grandma Ruth? He asked. I looked. Smiled faintly. She taught me to sew, I said. Every stitch had a story. He handed it to me. She looks like you. Strong. I nodded. She was. He hesitated. Then added, I think we forgot who built this place first. I placed the photo beside my thread. Let it sit there. Visible. And that night, I fell asleep with the scent of lavender in the thread and history resting beside my bed. The next morning the swing was there. Rebuilt. The wood was lighter than before. Unweathered. New screws. Fresh rope. But the shape was the same. 2 slats across the back. Curved arms. A slight dip in the seat where memory could rest. Stephanie stood beside it, hands dusty, eyes unsure. It's not perfect, she said. But we followed your husband's old plans, they were in the shed. I touched the armrest. Smooth. Warm from the sun. It's strong, I said. She looked relieved. Andrew brought out lemonade. 3 glasses. No words. We sat together, awkward at first. But then the breeze came. And the swing moved. Gently. Just like it used to. I closed my eyes. Listened to the creak of rope against wood beam. Stephanie said I didn't know this mattered so much. I kept my eyes closed. It's not the swing. It's what it meant. She nodded. Andrew asked, do you think we could get the garden back? The way it was. I opened my eyes. Met his. We won't get it back. But we can grow something new. He smiled. Quietly. Later that afternoon I walked the hallway again. This time, there was a frame on the floor. An old photo of our family at the lake. The glass had cracked in one corner. I bent to pick it up. Stephanie appeared beside me. I dropped it, she said. I'm sorry. I looked at the frame. At the crack. Then handed it back to her. Some things don't need fixing, I said. They just need remembering. She cradled it in both hands. Held it like it still mattered. And for once I believed she meant it. That night I sat on the new swing. Alone. The stars were out. Cool air brushed my arms. I thought of Richard. Of quilts. Of threads not broken but waiting to be retied. Of rooms I once tiptoed through. Now walked through slowly. But with belonging. And under the porch light in the silence I smiled. Not because it was perfect. But because it was mine again. Before I went in, I looked out at the street. Same sidewalk. Same tree that split the curb. Same mailbox with its squeaky hinge. But something had changed. Not the place me. I no longer shrank at their footsteps. No longer waited for permission to belong. I turned off the porch light. Not because I was done, but because I was home. Inside, the hallway felt softer. Even the silence had a place now. In my room, I placed the cracked photo on the dresser. Did not replace the glass. Let it stay imperfect. Let it speak. I folded the apron, slipped Richard's letter inside the pocket, and rested it at the foot of the bed. Then I pulled the quilt over my knees. The one they thought was decoration. But I knew better. It was history stitched by hand. A banner. And finally, it was being seen again. It began with a question. From Andrew. At breakfast, he looked up from his plate and asked, "What happens to the house when someday comes?" The air shifted. Stephanie paused mid-sip. I folded my napkin. "What do you mean?" I asked. He cleared his throat. "I mean, later. When you're not here, what happens?" I stirred my tea. Let the steam hide my face. "It depends," I said. "On what I decide to write down." Stephanie's eyes widened slightly. Andrew leaned forward. "I don't want to fight," he said. "I just want to make sure it's not messy." I met his gaze. "For whom?" He blinked. "For all of us." I nodded slowly. Later that morning, I opened the desk drawer. Pulled out the small folder with my will. Unfinished. Unclear. I sat at the kitchen table. Pen in hand. Blank form waiting. But I didn't fill it in. Not yet. Instead, I wrote a letter. In longhand. Each word chosen with care. I built this home with love. Not for you to inherit by default, but to carry if you're worthy. I paused. The pen rested against the paper. The clock ticked softly. I want this house to stay a home. Not a prize. Not a burden. I folded the letter. Slid it into the folder. Left the form untouched. Outside, Andrew was trimming the hedge. Stephanie was watering the new herbs. She wore gloves now. Learned which plants liked shade. I watched them from the window. Then closed the curtain. Not out of secrecy, but sovereignty. Some choices must be made with the door gently shut. That afternoon, I called Harold. "Come by," I said. "It's time we made things clear." He arrived with a leather briefcase and eyes that remembered everything. We sat at the table. "I'm not writing a will," I said. "I'm writing instructions." He smiled. I liked the sound of that. We spent the next hour drawing up a living trust. Not just for the house. For the land. The garden. The memories. I named the conditions clearly. No resale without intention. No inheritance without stewardship. If it becomes just walls, I said, they lose it. Harold raised an eyebrow. And if they keep it as home, then it stays, I said. As long as it's lived in with dignity. He nodded. We drafted every clause. Every exception. Then he passed me the folder. "You're ready." I held the pen steady. Signed slowly. My name in full. Legible. Unapologetic. When he left, I walked out to the porch. The swing creaked gently in the breeze. I sat. Held the folder in my lap. Across the lawn, Stephanie and Andrew were planting new azaleas. She looked up. Met my eyes. I didn't wave. Didn't nod. But I stayed in place. Visible. Rooted. And for once they let me be without trying to move me. The next day I placed the trust document in the safe. Not the drawer. Not under the bed. The safe Richard installed in 1999. behind the bookshelf, the one only I knew how to open. I tucked the folder beside our wedding certificate and the deed to the land. Layered truths. Quietly kept. Then I went about my day. Stephanie was baking again. Something with cinnamon. The scent filled the house like it used to on winter mornings. Andrew had taken to fixing small things. A squeaky hinge. A loose handle. A crooked drawer. They were moving in the direction of care. Not to impress, not to erase, but to restore. I noticed but said nothing. Just as I had noticed the photo of Richard now placed above the fireplace. Center. Framed in walnut. Not gold. I dusted around it. Let it be. That afternoon, Andrew found me in the garden. I was wondering, he said, if you'd show me how to trim the roses properly. I handed him the shears. Watched as he snipped too high. Too shallow. He winced. I knelt beside him. Guided his hand. Here, I said. Just above the third leaf. He tried again. Better. The stems fell clean. The bush sighed in relief. You really remember everything, he said. No, I replied. Just the things that matter. We pruned in silence. Later, Stephanie called us in for tea. The table was set. 3 cups. The blue one in front of my seat. A small gesture. Loud in its intention. I poured slowly. Steam curled upward. She placed a plate of scones between us. The lavender ones, she said. I found your old recipe. I took one. Broke it open. The smell of before. Not nostalgia. Recognition. Of something that might last this time. After tea, I stood at the kitchen window. The light hit the sink just the way it used to in late spring. I reached under the cabinet. The tin box was still there. Old measuring spoons. Faded recipes. A note from Richard tucked behind a vanilla packet. Use less sugar. You're sweet enough. I smiled. Stephanie came to stand beside me. Not too close. I didn't know about the safe, she said. The one behind the bookshelf. I turned to her. You were never meant to. She nodded. Didn't push further. I'm not asking for the house, she said. I just want you to know. I see you now. Her voice caught. She cleared her throat. And walked away. I stayed at the window a moment longer. The sky was shifting. Dusky gold. Soft blue at the edges. And in that light, everything old felt quietly honored. 8th of May. That weekend, Harold returned with final documents. He wore a tie this time. Same brown jacket, same quiet dignity. We sat on the porch as the swing creaked gently. I included your instructions, he said. Everything you wanted. No room for confusion. He handed me the final file. Bound. Numbered. Stamped. I flipped through it slowly. Names. Dates. Clauses. Then a single line set apart. This home shall remain in the custody of dignity. My throat tightened. But I did not cry. Stephanie brought us lemonade. Poured without asking. Left without comment. Harold watched her go. She's softened, he said. I nodded. She's learning. He tapped the folder. So have you. We both smiled. The swing kept time. After he left, I placed the folder in the safe. Next to Richard's letter. Next to the photo of our first Thanksgiving here. Then I pulled out a small envelope. Blank. Inside the deed copy, I wrote 3 words on the outside. For when ready. That evening, Andrew sat beside me on the swing. He didn't ask. Didn't talk. Just leaned back, looked up at the sky. There's space here, he said. Even when we mess it up. I let that settle. Then said space is earned. So is stillness. He nodded. Stephanie joined us later. Blanket over her lap. Tea in her hand. No music. No screens. Just breathing. Just dusk. I looked at them both. Then said, one day I'll be gone. Stefania flinched. Andrew tensed. But I continued. When that happens, what you hold isn't mine. It's yours. If you hold it right. They were quiet. I'm not leaving instructions to control you. I'm leaving them so you don't forget me. Andrew reached for my hand. Stephanie did too. And for the first time our hands rested together on the old swing Richard built with love and the belief that some things are worth circling back to. The porch light flickered on. Not from a switch. From a timer Richard set years ago. A small thing. But steady. I looked down at our hands. Wrinkled. Worn. Different. But aligned. I'm not afraid of going, I said. I'm only afraid of being forgotten wrong. Andrew nodded. His grip tightened. I used to think legacy was money, he said. But this house. It's you. Stephanie whispered. It's the only place I've ever felt safe. The wind moved through the chimes. Slow. Certain. I let the moment stretch. Then slowly stood. Left their hands. Walked to the edge of the porch. Looked out. The mailbox. The tree. The windows glowing amber. And I thought this is how you pass something on. Not in a hurry. Not in a storm. But in silence, on a swing with your name still echoing through the beams. I turned back. Smiled. And for once they smiled with me. It happened on a Tuesday. Rain tapping the windows. Quiet. Unassuming. I was in the hallway, adjusting the frame of Richard's photo. It always tilted slightly left after a storm. Stephanie's voice called out sharp, but not loud. Andrew. It's here. I turned. A man stood in the doorway. Suit. Clipboard. Plastic smile. I'm here for the walk-through, he said. 3-bedroom 1.5 bath correct. My blood cooled. Stephanie stepped forward. Flushed. There's been a misunderstanding, she said quickly. No showing today. The man blinked. Checked his notes. This is 217 Ash Lane. Yes, I have a confirmed appointment. Your husband said. Andrew came down the stairs. His face pale. I didn't think she'd be here, he muttered. My knees locked. You didn't think. Who would be here, I asked. He froze. Stephanie stepped between us. It was just a conversation, she said. We didn't sign anything. I stared at them. The man looked from face to face, clearly uncomfortable. I can reschedule, he offered. No need, I said. I walked to the foyer. Opened the closet. Pulled out the folder. The one labeled trust. I opened it slowly. Turned to the page. Placed it flat on the entry table. The agent leaned in. Read the clause. Whistled low. Well, then he said. Looks like this house isn't for sale after all. Andrew didn't speak. Stephanie stared at the floor. I closed the folder. Returned it to its place. Then I turned to them. You thought I wouldn't know. You thought silence meant surrender. Andrew opened his mouth. Then shut it again. I didn't raise my voice. You may live here. But this house breathes with my name. I walked past them. To the porch. The swing creaked in the breeze. Behind me, they didn't follow. The rain thickened. Soft, steady. Like applause from somewhere I couldn't see. I sat on the swing. Let the wood hold me. Inside, the front door clicked shut. Footsteps scattered. Murmurs behind walls. But I didn't go in. I looked out at the sidewalk. Same cracks. Same puddle, forming beneath the maple. I remembered the day we closed on the house. Richard lifted me onto the porch like it was a stage. "You picked this place," he said. "Which means it'll never belong to anyone else." I carpaced. Slow, curious. Maybe the agent had told them a viewing was scheduled. I almost laughed. No more viewings. No more pretending. This house was not a listing. It was memory with a roof. And a signature written in years. I leaned back. The chimes moved softly. No storm could shake them down. Not while I still lived with both feet on my own floor. The next morning, the kitchen was quiet. No coffee brewing. No toast popping. Just stillness. I moved through it, like a guest in my own space. Andrew sat at the table. A legal pad in front of him. His pen unmoving. He looked up. "I made a mistake," he said. "I didn't sit. Just watched him." I thought he stopped. Then tried again. "I thought I could handle things without making it hard on you." I folded the dish towel in my hand. "It wasn't hard," I said. "It was revealing." Stefania entered. No makeup. Eyes red. "I didn't know he scheduled it," she said. "I found out an hour before." I said nothing. She stepped closer. Held out a manila envelope. I wrote a statement. Declining interest. Removing myself from any future claim. Her hand trembled. But she held it out. I took it. Briefly. Then placed it on the counter without opening it. Andrew stood. "I didn't bring you here to make you feel erased." I raised my eyebrows. "But you didn't stop it either." He sat again. "I want to make it right," he said. "That's not your choice," I said. "Making it right isn't something you get to define." Silence. Only the clock ticking. Then Stephanie said, "Tell us how." I turned toward her. "Start by acknowledging this house doesn't exist because of your mortgage. It exists because someone loved you enough to give you a roof before you knew what shelter meant." She blinked. Bit her lip. Andrew nodded. "Once. I understand," he said. I doubted it. But I let him say it. Because some lessons must echo in silence before they settle. That afternoon I walked the garden alone. The roses were blooming again. New buds. Soft edges. Some things bloom only after the pruning. Especially trust. I paused by the roses. Breathed in deep. The air still held a trace of cinnamon from yesterday's scones. Familiar. But faint. I knelt. Pulled a few weeds by hand. Felt the dirt under my nails. The same way I had when Richard and I first planted them. Not every root deserves to stay. Some must be pulled for others to thrive. A wind moved through the garden. Not cold, but clear. I looked toward the house. Saw their shadows moving past the curtains. They had not left. But neither had I. Later that evening, I sat by the fireplace. Tea cooling in my lap. The envelope still lay unopened on the counter. I did not rush. Let it sit. Let them wonder. Some forgiveness is not about words. It is about making them live with the weight of almost losing what they never truly earned, and letting them choose whether to carry that weight with grace. By Sunday, they had stopped speaking in hushed tones. Stopped tiptoeing. Stopped pretending. Stephanie knocked on my door mid-morning. "I'd like to repaint the guest room," she said. "If that's all right with you." I raised an eyebrow. "It's not yours to change." She nodded. "I know. That's why I asked." I looked at her for a long moment. Then said, "What color?" She smiled. Something soft. Good, I said. Then start by scrubbing the walls. Every inch. She did. On her knees. No complaint. Andrew replaced the broken banister rail. Didn't announce it. Just did it. At dinner, they set the table again. No blue cup this time, but a saucer with my initials. It wasn't perfect. But it was intentional. Afterward, I stood at the doorway, watching the two of them clear the dishes. No bickering, no side glances. Just rhythm. Quiet effort. I walked to the safe. Pulled out the envelope. The one labeled. For when ready. I placed it on the table. Andrew returned and saw it. He didn't reach for it. Just sat down. I don't know if I am, he said. I sat too. I'll be the one to know, I said. Not you. He exhaled. Then nodded. Stefania stood nearby. Still. Waiting. I looked at them both. This house, I said, will never belong to people who forget who planted the first brick. Andrew lowered his head. Not in shame. But in memory. I remember now, he said. The way Dad paused before unlocking the door. I closed my eyes. Saw it too. Felt the key turn in my own hand. I opened my eyes. Met his. Then slowly, I slid the envelope across the table. But didn't let go. Read it, I said. Do not speak. Then place it back exactly where you found it. He nodded. Took the envelope with both hands. Opened it carefully. Read every line. His jaw tensed as he reached the clause. The one Richard and I wrote together. Stephanie stepped closer. Peeked over his shoulder. Her breath caught. It's in her name, Andrew whispered. Everything. Stephanie's eyes welled. Yes, I said. And that will not change unless you do. They looked at each other. No panic. Just gravity. I stood. You may continue living here, I said. If you understand this is not a gift, it's a trust. They nodded. Not in defeat. But in acceptance. Later that night, I found the envelope back in the safe. In its exact place. Facing forward. And beside it a note in Andrew's hand. Thank you for the second chance to be worthy. I closed the safe. Felt the latch click. Not with finality. But with peace. Spring arrived like a quiet visitor with soft shoes. The garden bloomed early. Roses. Lavender. Even the azaleas we thought had died. Stephanie placed a new welcome mat at the front door. It read, Home is earned. I said nothing. But I left it there. Andrew painted the porch swing. Same shade as before, but this time he asked first. I sat on it often. Sometimes alone. Sometimes with Stephanie shelling peas. No words. Just the rhythm of old things being made new. The envelope never left the safe. Nor did the folder. But they both knew exactly where it was. And they never tried to reach for it again. One afternoon I found a small card tucked into the edge of the kitchen mirror. In Stephanie's handwriting. Thank you for letting me stay long enough to grow roots. I smiled. Folded it and placed it between the pages of my recipe book. The blue cup stayed in its spot on the top shelf. No one touched it. But every Sunday, Stephanie brought me tea in the saucer with my initials. Lavender. Light sugar. No questions asked. Andrew began calling Harold himself, asking questions. Learning. Not to hurry me. But to prepare. He never asked again about inheritance. He just showed up. In the garden. In the kitchen. In small repairs he never mentioned. One morning I watched him fix the mailbox flag. It had been broken for years. He never asked if it mattered. but he fixed it anyway. That evening, I baked a pie. Apple like Richard used to make. I set 3 plates. 3 forks. When I sat down I said nothing. But Andrew looked at me. You remembered the cinnamon, he said. I nodded. Stefania lit a candle. We ate slow. Soft. Like it might be the last time. Not because I was leaving. But because we'd learned to stop wasting meals on silence. After dinner, they cleared the table. Together. Then Andrew said, we talked. And if you're willing, we'd like to add your name to the hallway wall. I paused. The gallery. He nodded. Yes. Next to Dad's same-size frame. Stephanie added you deserve to be seen here. I stood. Walked to the hallway. Studied the wall. Empty spots remained. But the center, the part where the light always hit in the late afternoon, had been left clear. Waiting. I traced it with one finger. Then nodded once. Yes, I said. And for the first time since they moved in they both followed me without hesitation. That weekend Stephanie brought home a wooden frame. Simple. Walnut finish, no embellishments. She handed it to me. I thought you might want to choose the photo. I opened my drawer. Pulled out an old picture. Me on the porch in my librarian cardigan, Richard behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder. I like this one, I said. I look like someone who knew what she was doing. Andrew smiled. You did. We hung it together. Right in the middle. Level. Honest. That night, I passed the hallway again. Saw the way the photo caught the light. How it faced the door. As if to say, this home remembers. And I knew legacy wasn't just about who came after. It was about who refused to vanish while still alive. The house no longer creaked like a protest. It breathed. Settled. And in that quiet, I felt the roots finally hold. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. The days grew longer. Soft light lingered in the corners. Mornings began with porch tea. Evenings ended with quilted silence. Stephanie planted herbs outside the kitchen window. She labeled them carefully, not just names, but memories. Rosemary one said for the roast you made on Sundays. Mint another read for the time you let me stay. Andrew repaired the back gate. The one Richard never got to finish. No announcement. No audience. Just quiet completion. I spent more time in the den. Sorting photo albums. Labeling backs of pictures with full names and years. I didn't want stories to become guesses. One afternoon I handed Andrew a worn box. Inside old family tapes. Some still in their paper sleeves. He smiled. I'll digitize these. Not all watch. Not all take. Just preserve. That evening, Stephanie brought out a journal. Leather-bound. Tied with twine. We've been writing, she said. Things you say. Things we notice. She handed it to me. First page read. She still knows the name of every tree on this block. I laughed. Then cried. Because it meant they saw me. Not just as someone who stayed, but someone who shaped. One morning I walked the house slowly. Touched the walls. Named them softly in my head. This was where Richard danced with Andrew after his graduation. This is where I stitched the last square of the first quilt. This is where I almost gave up. But didn't. I opened the safe. Took out the folder. Took out the envelope. Held both for a long while. Then placed them in a new box. Labeled it. To be opened when the house is ready for new hands. I sealed it. Placed it on the top shelf. And then I breathed. Not because something ended. But because something had finally settled. That night we had dinner outside. Pie again. The crust better this time. Stephanie lit 2 candles. Andrew poured water like it was wine. No one said anything profound. No speeches. No declarations. Just the sounds of chairs sliding, silverware tapping, and a house holding us all like it finally understood we had all returned. Not from distance, but from forgetting. I looked up at the sky. Soft blue. A streak of gold at the edge. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a guest in the home I built. I felt named. Known. Safe. Later that night, Stephanie knocked gently. She held a photo. Me in the garden, sunlight on my hair. I took this last week, she said. I thought it should go in the hallway. I took the frame from her hands. Felt its weight. Felt the moment. She waited. I nodded. Bottom row. Under Richards. She smiled. Left or right? Right, I said. Always the right. Together we hung it. The nail went in clean. The photo sat level. Not for decoration, but for truth. That night I slept without the folder under my bed, without the keys hidden in my robe pocket. And I dreamed, not of the past, but of the swing. Moving gently, holding weight, without breaking, just enough to carry memory forward. The late sunlight touches the wood grain of the old table, and for a moment, everything feels soft again. I've learned that legacy isn't loud. Sometimes, it's just a name remembered in silence. And a pie shared with grace. What quiet legacy do you hope to leave behind? We'd love to read your story in the comments below. You are not alone. Your journey matters. Subscribe to Grandma Radio, where every story is a second chance.